had crowns. You know why? Because they were then ruling. In that time frame that he saw, they weren't ruling in Daniel's time. They were an imagery of what was coming. You with me? But in John's time, he had already stepped out in the future where they would be ruling the world. Oh, come on, somebody. Both saw the resurrection of the dead, Daniel 12 and 2, and Revelation chapter 7, 9 through 17. Both of them saw the Lord set up His kingdom. Daniel saw an everlasting kingdom of the Messiah in Daniel 7, 13, 14, and John saw Christ ruling and reigning for 1,000 years. However, and this is important to hear this, there is something that John saw that Daniel did not. As a matter of fact, in the book of Revelation, there are things that John saw that nobody... do you understand? Nobody ever saw the New Jerusalem till John. Nobody ever gave the dimensions of the city till John. Nobody ever told you the stones that it was made of till John. Nobody ever told you the Messiah was coming back on a white horse except John. Preach on, Perry, I'm going to. Nobody ever saw the binding of Satan except John. So John saw things that the others didn't, right? Now, here's the verse I want to read to you. You can just jot it down if you like. It's the book of Revelation, chapter 17, verse 10. Here's what it says. There are also 7 kings. 5 are fallen. One is, the other's not yet come, and when he comes, he must continue a short space. The beast that was and is not is himself also the 8th, and he is of the 7, but he will go into destruction, or he will go into perdition. Now, I want to bring up a list, and I'm going to show you the empires of prophecy based on this prophecy given to John. Here's what they are. The first head of this beast is the Egyptian Empire. Now watch, they all had something in common. You know what they all had in common? They dealt with Israel, Jerusalem, and the Jews. I'm telling you that when I saw that list, I found out that there's over 100 empires that have ruled the world. The Huns aren't mentioned there. The Chinese aren't mentioned. You know why? Because they didn't have dealing with Israel, Jerusalem, and the Jews. That's why the prophets use these empires. Okay, the first one is Egypt, that put Israel into captivity, and they lived there for over 200 and some years, okay, in captivity until they came out. The second one was the Assyrians. Do you know what the Assyrians did? They took 10 tribes captive and divided Israel, and all they left was Benjamin and Judah, the only 2 left, which was the southern kingdom. Babylon, look at this. You know what they did, don't you? They invaded the place, destroyed the temple, burnt the temple down, took the treasures, and took the Jews captive to Babylon. Look at this. Then after the Babylonians came the Medes and Persians. They were friendly to the Jews. Darius the Mede and Cyrus helped the Jews to restore their temple. They rebuilt it. And by the way, these were Persians. That's important later on. The 5th empire was Greece. There's a whole story behind Greece that I don't want to get into with Alexander the Great. It would take too long. Now, John said in his day, 5 of these had fallen. They were gone. Egypt existed, but was no longer an empire. The Assyrians are Syrians. It existed, but no longer an empire. Babylon, it still existed, but it was no longer an empire. The Medes and Persians still existed, but they were no longer an empire. And Greece was already defeated. The Hellenistic culture was all over the world, but it was no longer an empire. Who ruled when John wrote the book of Revelation? Talk to me, somebody. Rome. 5 are fallen, 1 is. What is the 1 is? 95 AD, John wrote the book of Revelation. I can prove that by the early church fathers. That's the date because they give you the year that the emperor died when he wrote it. And Domitian died, and after he died, it's when John wrote the book of Revelation. All these preterists say it was written before the destruction of the temple. No, it was not. Because let somebody tell you that lived back then. Come on, talk to me, somebody. I'd rather listen to somebody who lived back then than knows, and some dude that thinks he knows something that lived in the year 1999. Stay with me. So, John's day, Rome was ruling. Rome kept ruling. Rome, in some form, has always been ruling. Because even when Imperial Rome fell, there was the Holy Roman Empire that came. I'm going to go ahead and preach this in a minute. Stay with me. But here's the part that gets you. Ready? There is a 7th coming who will continue a short space. Then in the book of Revelation 13, number 8 shows up, who is the Antichrist himself, who rules for 42 months. Stop and listen to this very carefully. Because every time I've ever tried to preach this, and this kind of thing is hard to preach on TV because it's much harder holding people's attention when the dog is barking and the kids are running in the house. Come on, talk to me. And you just burnt the toast. You lose people on something real heavy. But I want you to clean your ears out. Let me get this across to you because this is very important you understand this. If there is a 7-year period coming, and there really is, one empire rules the first half of that. And one empire rules the last 42 months out of those 7. You know what that means? That means that the 7th empire John mentioned hadn't come yet. And someone asked me, Perry, why has there been such a gap? I said, I'm going to tell you why there was a gap. Because in the book of Daniel, he talks about the 70 weeks of prophecy. And there has been a gap between week 69 and week 70. The 70th week of Daniel 9:27 is 7 years, and it's the tribulation period. And the reason there's been a gap is because when Christ died on the cross, the Gentiles were grafted in, the church age began, and the birth of the church, which was a new nation and a holy nation. And from 70 AD to 1948, there was no Israel, there were no Jews in Jerusalem, and there was no Jewish freedom of Jewish people returning. And the 70th week cannot prophetically start till 3 things happen. Israel is a nation, Jerusalem is the undisputed capital, and the Jews have returned, and that has now happened. That's why you never had a 7th empire ever come. Because it couldn't. It couldn't come. For it to come, it has to deal with the Jews. Read the book of Revelation. 2 witnesses come the first 42 months. What are they doing? Preaching to a group of Jews, 144,000, sealed with the seal of God. Now, how could there be 144,000 before 1948? And they go to Israel, and they're killed on the Temple Mount platform. How could that have happened before 1948? Are you listening? So my point is, the first 42 months of the tribulation, something has happened to form a 7th empire. But then the Antichrist rises with his group and takes over that empire and forms his own coalition for the last 42 months. Is this making sense to everybody? I got to get this in your mind before I can explain the rest of it. You want me to explain the rest of it? I'm not going to. No, I'm just kidding. All right. Let's bring him over. This is Nebi number 2. I have a much more beautiful Nebi in my studio. But I don't take him to too many churches because he gets beat up and dent up and people try to lay hands on him and slay him in the spirit and all kinds of stuff. Let me explain to you this prophetic dream that King Nebuchadnezzar had. Nebuchadnezzar has a dream in Daniel chapter 2, and he has a dream of a man. What is interesting about him dreaming about a man is the Persians believed in that day that human government was in the form of a human man. And they even gave 7 different kinds of metals that would be connected to human government. So this idea was already in the earth before Nebuchadnezzar ever had this dream. Head of gold, chest and arms of silver, thigh of brass. All of this is in Daniel 2. 2 legs of iron. And when you come down toward the bottom, it's 2 feet. Everybody say this. 2 feet and 10 toes. The Bible makes it clear, 2 feet and 10 toes. That's important, and I'll explain why in a minute. The interpretation comes back that Babylon, this is the Babylon that Daniel and his friends Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were part of. They're the head of gold. The chest and arms of silver are the empire of Media Persia that overtook Babylon. Then they ruled for a good while, and then Alexander the Great comes along, and he's the hips of brass, and they take over the Medes and Persians. I'll show you something in a minute. And then after them came the Roman Empire, which is represented by the iron legs. What is interesting is, Babylon had more gold than any other empire in history. Point one. The Medes and Persians collected their taxes in silver, and their horses even had silver harnesses. Alexander the Great used brass. Brass weapons, brass helmets. And the Romans were known for iron. Iron chariots, they used iron very effectively. Isn't that interesting? So in other words, God chooses the metal, not just because it's a lesser metal all the way down. Notice how it deteriorates the further you go, right? But He chooses a metal that represents the empire of that particular day. Now, we've come through this, and this part here. Now let me explain to you this part here, and let me explain this to you the best I can, because this is the part that can get a little bit complicated, and I'm going to try to keep this just as absolutely simple as I can. Hallelujah. Let's go to number 3. Let's go to the legs chart. Legs chart, that's funny, isn't it? All right. Now I want you to keep that up